Welcome back to Mindkind Podcasts. This is Dr. Jo North returning to our platform. Mindkind continues to be a reflective space for anyone who wants to stay sane in our demanding world. Our intention is to inspire, motivate and inform people of all ages interested in mental health and well-being. I'll be drawing on 35 years of practice as a psychotherapist, and we'll be looking at research and therapy along the way and talking with other experts in the field so we can draw on their skill. If something affects the mind, we'll be talking about it. So let's get on with today's podcast. Welcome, and I'm so pleased to be able to introduce my colleague Nickie today. Now, Nickie Burrows is a teacher, she's trained as a teacher, and she has worked for over 30 years in teaching. She also is a Thrive practitioner, which means that she's trained to teach children to thrive in primary and infant schools. So Nickie and I are going to be talking about adoption and the unique identity of adopted people, because there's a lot to understand about this special type of experience of being brought up in the world. And I know I've worked in this field for a lot of years. Nickie is in herself an adopted person, an adopted adult. She was adopted in the 60s, and it was an adoption where that time when mothers had their children taken from them. And she has a big story about the tracing of her adopted mother and her adopted father and her primary genetic family. But she also has a big investment in helping adopted people. So she is an adult adoptee on the Adult Adoptee Advisory Group for Adoption UK. And the purpose of this group is to advise Adoption UK in its aims to represent the perspectives of adults who have been adopted. And what I tend to find in working with a lot of, first of all, adults who have been adopted, but secondly, children and families, which is the main focus of my work on a day-to-day basis, is there's a lot of unique experiences. And there is a lack of recognition of what it means to be adopted and the extra support that might be needed to help adopted people feel that they belong. So you'll notice in my conversations with Nickie that we address common issues such as belonging, the sense of being an outsider, how difficult it is to integrate the two stories of a genetic primary birth parent with an adopted parent. And in our conversation, we will, of course, acknowledge the amazing work that adopted parents do to bring up adopted children, and more modern view of helping children understand what we call their life story. As human beings in the psychological world, we really do need to bring our story with us. It's so important to our well-being. And if your story is complicated or hard to put together, you might not find that this is so easy to do. We know that pulling together your life story is so helpful to well-being and emotional settlement and security. So there's a lot of trauma sometimes involved in being adopted, that you may have been adopted under traumatic circumstances. And at the moment, there's a bid in the UK to ask for what's called an adoption apology, because in the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s, a lot of young mums had children taken from them, not on any basis other than the fact that they were deemed to be too young. And there was a lot of social discrimination against them for having had children so young. Most regrettable situation. And there's a whole push now, political push, to put this right. But what Nickie and I also talk about is the difference between the adoptions of that time and now the modern adoption of young families trying to bring up children who might have been traumatized, who will have a disrupted attachment that will affect them, and how we're trying to pull that together. So it's a great conversation. You're going to hear about Nickie's own story of adoption, which is incredibly intense, and I hope you're going to enjoy listening to us. So, Nickie, it's so great to talk with you.
Oh,
And yeah, thanks so much for sharing with us because I know that you've had a really amazing and very interesting and very complicated adoption story yourself. And what we're trying to do here is talk about the needs of adopted people and we don't want to sort of make them feel like they're a kind of subgroup in themselves, but like it's a unique experience being adopted. It's a unique identity, and we really want to put that out there in the world more because I think it is something that gets sort of, oh yeah, you've been adopted, oh lucky you, it gets brushed over.
definitely.
Yeah, I know you. I mean, I know in your work, you're very mindful and you do this super work with Adoption UK. But first of all, just can you describe your story of first of all of adoption, but then you had a connection with your family, and I know it's not a small story, is it?
No, no. So I was adopted in the 60s. I didn't know very much about in fact, I knew very little at all about my story. Um, I was just told that my mother couldn't look after me, and but I was very, very curious. I always thought about my mother particularly. It's complicated even as a child, I think. I think you sort of have these feelings of, difficult feelings about being given away, and then you also have positive feelings towards your birth family too. So it's complicated in that respect. So I had all that. Nobody ever talked about my adoption. Um, my school, I don't think my school were ever told, although I think I mentioned it and eventually people knew, but there were never any allowances made for being adopted, or in fact, I know that there were no allowances made because I had some quite tricky times at school and, I just got into trouble all the time rather than nobody ever helped me through anything. Anyway,
Mm.
I left school and carried on with my life, and was when I was in my 50s during the pandemic, I received a letter from an agency saying that somebody wanted to be in touch with me, and I was really I didn't know what to make of it. I really just didn't know what to do with it at all. I had thought so many times about tracing my mother, but it just felt so complicated, I think. It just felt really I didn't know how to do it. I didn't feel strong enough. And anyway, I didn't know who it was tracing me, and eventually I found out from the agency that it was my mother, and she had written me a letter and had explained that she had got pregnant as an unmarried teenager and had been forced to give me away and had wanted to find me ever since, which was lovely and very good to know when you've no idea why you hadn't been kept. And it was difficult because my mother had had a stroke just before she found me, and it was difficult to be in touch with her. She couldn't write anymore. She couldn't use her laptop or write me an email or anything. But eventually, we had a few phone calls together, and things were going reasonably well. They were complicated, but they were going quite well. And then we've been in touch a few months, and we talked about meeting up, but we were waiting for the COVID restrictions to be lifted, and we were making plans actually. And then I found out she was ill and she'd been rushed to hospital, and she was quite seriously ill. And I drove to try and meet her. She was living a long way away from where I live, hours and hours away. It was about a 10, 12-hour drive away. And I drove and drove and drove to try and meet her, and she died just before I got there. And I missed her by an hour or two.
Yeah, yeah. I know that was an extremely difficult time for you, and I had the privilege of being able to support you a bit at that time. And I know that it took you a long time to get through that. I think that it would have taken you a long time to get through meeting her, but it certainly took double that to get through the fact that you were nearly there, and then she passed away just before you got there, and it was it was a shock. And thank you so much for sharing that story, because I know even though you're very open about it, it's still a really tough story. And I think what's great is that we're putting it out there, because I think, you know from all your work in adoption that you do now, and all the work that I do, that there are a lot of people out there with those missed connections.
Yes.
Today, as we speak right now, you and I know that there are a lot of missed connections like that. And I know that you're involved with Adoption UK in thinking about that as an organisation and how we can help adopted adults. I think there's so much in the story, isn't there? And again, holding in mind that our overarching goal at Mindkind is that if it affects the mind, we want to know about it. And the adopted community in the UK runs into millions of people. And we know that there will be millions of stories out there. I suppose, gosh, what bit do we look at first? And I think that must be such a hard thing for adopted adults now. What piece do we need to look at? So I wonder if you and I could think about that a bit, Nickie. What do you think would be helpful? If the sky was blue, how would we help adopted people in their lives and their identity, do you think?
First of all, I think adopted people just want to be heard, and they want to be acknowledged that being adopted is not, a walk in the park. People assume that you're very lucky to be adopted, and they see the lovely side of it. They see, oh, aren't you lucky? You've got a lovely family, and you should be very grateful. And there is that side.
Mm,
There are some lovely stories, but not all of them are. And there's always the side that people forget, is that you've lost an entire family to be adopted. And there's a lot of grief surrounding that. And also a you've lost your identity. You have no idea who you are,
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
and it's a very weird thing to not know who you are.
Well, I hear that so much, and I think that that's one of the pieces of the jigsaw, isn't it? I hear people say, "I never saw anyone that looked like me."
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, and I know that you've said that, and I've known that. So I've got the privilege of knowing a little bit of your story, and that you have met further family members, because you didn't give up when you lost your mum, and you went on to meet further family members. And the first thing you said, "Oh, there's actually people out there that look like me," and we just take that for granted, don't we?
Yeah, I think people do.
Mm,
And it is really also very strange when you do find somebody that looks like you
mm,
that you don't know. It's not that, you might meet a very close relative, but you don't actually know them as a person. And then you see yourself mirrored back, and
mm.
it's like, whoa, this is really
Yeah,
spooky, but it's
yeah.
nice. I mean, it's lovely,
Mm.
just strange when it's never happened. And yet I wanted that. I always wanted that, even as a child. I wanted to look like somebody.
Mm.
So I think that's the first thing that we need to acknowledge. I keep seeing all these lovely adoption stories on these reels on the internet, and everybody's saying how wonderful it is, and aren't they lucky? And actually makes me really quite upset to see them, because I think they're just a snatch of the whole story, really.
They are just a snatch of the whole story, because the truth is it's complicated, isn't it? I mean, I think if you meet up with people, you've got to remember that there's such a long, long history there. And that I think with adopted people, they have two worlds. That's what I see. You have your world that you were brought up in, your kind of like your social learning world, and your adopted family, and then you have your genetic experience of yourself, your genetic biological experience, and you have to be able to put those two parts together. And I just don't think we can underestimate how much time and thought that takes.
Yes, yeah, it's difficult. It really is
Yeah,
difficult.
yeah,
But also, in your own immediate family, you're having to fit with people who are not your fit, you
yeah.
know. I
Mm.
know Adoption UK have a group for, I think it's young adults, and they call it Square Peg. And I really like that name. I just think that that is what it's like. You are a square peg in a round hole.
Yes, yeah. And I think that even the most fantastic adoptive families, and let's face it, there's plenty out there.
Yeah,
There's loads of fantastic, really loving, kind adoptive parents out there. We need to talk about the difference between adoptions now and the sort of adoption that your mother would have been put through and that you were put through. And so there's quite a big story. There's a political story there. So a bit of a shout out for the adoption apology people, because they
yeah,
do you know people in that?
yes,
Yes. Do you?
yes.
Yes.
Um, yes, I've done a bit of work with them, and they have very harrowing stories.
Well, they do, but I think the whole thing is that they say that those adoptions in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s, 1950 to 1980, were very often based on prejudice, and
Yeah.
the prejudice of, oh, a mother was pregnant young, therefore she was deemed not to be fit to keep a baby. And a lot of racial prejudice is in that story. So in a mixed heritage child, that would be a prejudiced approach, because that wasn't acceptable in that era. And there's so much mental and emotional pain caused by these assumptions. So the adoption apology people are seeking an apology for that what we call forced adoption. There was a cross-party inquiry into the matter that was set up by Harriet Harman, and they concluded that a lot of the adoptions in that time were inappropriate and unkind and harmful, basically, is the paper that went out as a result of that. So there's still a lot of mums out there. I mean, your mum, sadly, your birth mum died of a stroke, but she could easily be alive today,
Yes.
just about, I think. How old would she?
Yeah, she was 69. She
Yeah,
was
so
very
she
young.
was, yeah, she could easily be alive today. And she would be still struggling with the fact of what had happened to her, that forced adoption. Yeah. So
Yes,
you know.
yes, definitely.
Mm,
Um, and for the mothers, it was hidden too. I spoke to my cousin this last week, and he said that they had never spoken about me. I had never been mentioned
no,
at all.
no.
Although he had this vague idea that his aunt had been pregnant at some point. It was
Mm,
never ever spoken about. And so
mm,
she sort of had this shame that she'd lived with about it all of her life, you know.
mm, mm. A lot of the emotion of shame. And I think somehow I have met adopted adults who somehow seem to inherit shame and self-blame about having been adopted. I mean, illogically, there is no blame and there is no shame, but that somehow they inherit that as part of their psyche. Not everybody feels it intensely, but a lot of people do. Does that resonate with your experience?
Yes. I
Mm,
think part of that is because you don't know why you were given away. You know,
mm.
you just think there must have been something wrong with you, or I don't know, really. Yeah, you're right. You're not quite good enough.
Yeah. And I think that we tend to, if we don't know the story, and this brings us on to what the next complicated bit. I mean, it's all very complicated and it's all not, we don't serve the adopted adults community well, in truth. We don't
No.
make it easy for them to find their relatives, their birth relatives. We don't make it easy for them to get hold of their adoption papers. We don't make anything easy. And I know that have been people working towards making sure these things are smoother and easier, and I've certainly been one of them, and I know that you are in Adoption UK. But I think if people don't know their story, what they tend to do is they fill it and refer to themselves, and so often they say, well, it must have been because I wasn't worthy, or because and feel that they were rejected because they were, excuse the word, but defective in some way. And then when we go, and if we have the good fortune to get these papers and find them, we realize, well, actually there was this going on and that going on, and it certainly was nothing to do with you as a tiny infant. You were utterly helpless and had no choice.
Yes. And I think it's really useful to get your birth records for that reason, to find out.
Mm,
Although it's actually quite difficult to read the records, to
mm.
process the records. But it's really useful in that respect. I was able to change my ideas quite a bit about what had happened. So
Were you really?
yes.
Can you tell us a bit about that? It's really interesting.
Well, there was a long interview in my records that explained the whole circumstances of my adoption. But then there was also after I'd been relinquished, and I'd been kept in the hospital for a while, and then I was taken to a foster home, and I wasn't adopted for quite a number of months after that, even though my records said, the adoption agency said they thought that I would be easy to place. And I couldn't understand why. And then it turned out that my mother, who at this time was only 17, she was living in London, and she had to get her number of papers signed by a justice of the peace. And she was having to catch a bus and telephone this justice of the peace, catch a bus and go and find him, because it was always a him then. And there were a number of letters going backwards and forwards where she'd forgotten to get various things signed. And actually, it was a therapist that helped me to see this. She said to me, well, do you think that your mother was actually trying to delay the whole process? Do you think she was just holding on to the fact that maybe she could find a way to keep you? And it just changed my mind about the whole thing, really, because it
Yeah.
was a nice way to think of it.
Yes. Thank you so much. That's so vital, isn't it? And I know that there's a man running a website called Thriving Adoptees. He runs a blog. You know Simon Ben, who
Yeah.
and he tells the same story. He's very, very intent on people knowing their story so that they don't fill in the pieces in a negative way as against themselves. And I think the other tendency is that adopted people might blame themselves, and then the other ways they might blame the birth parents, and the birth parents often, I mean, literally, as you know, Nickie, well, I've worked with thousands of those cases, and I don't think I came across one case of a parent that said, I don't like this child, I'm giving them up for adoption. I honestly don't think I've ever come across that interpretation. And yet it's so easy as an adopted person, perhaps, that you might feel that you weren't wanted.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah,
what do you think, really?
yeah.
You know, as a child,
As
what
a child,
you have
exactly.
you
Yeah.
have nothing else to go on if you're not
Mm,
told anything.
mm.
Um, so yeah, I think it's really important to get your records, and I think adopted people do need a lot of help with that, not just with the whole process of finding them, which is tricky enough in itself, as you say. I don't know why it's so difficult. I don't know why people are still trying to make these things difficult for people. But then there's all the searching and reunion, which that's a whole other story, isn't it? You know,
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. That what's this secrecy around adoption papers? And actually, let's just address that because that's a really important issue, is that everybody has a right to their papers. And I think it's simply political will to make that more accessible. And what it would require would be frontline staff working on the issue. That's what it would
yes.
mean. And the reason it's not commonly available is because there aren't those staff, because there aren't the funds to do that, because this matter is not prioritized.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think again, adopted people, adopted adults now might say, oh, well, I'm not even worth finding my papers. But actually, that's no, what it means is somebody hasn't dug in and had the political will to do that. So, yeah, again, not the adopted person's fault. What I'm also really interested in, just sort of slightly shifting perspective, Nikki, if I can, to the situation now. So it's 2025, that there are a lot of families who adopt, and it's very different. So you weren't told anything about your adoption, which is, we know now that that's a pretty poor thing to do. A child needs to know their story, and we really encourage adoptive mums and dads to help their children thrive by engaging in their story and their unique story of their lives from a very young age. We encourage that. And do you think there are other ways that we could help parents who adopt help their adopted children to thrive? I mean, based on your experience, where you weren't really supported or encouraged. And I know, by the way, one of the things that you're involved in are these Thrive groups, because you really are passionate about, you're a teacher and you're passionate about children thriving. But do you have any thoughts that you could share about how adopted parents today could help their adopted children thrive?
I think it would be very helpful to try and keep in touch with their birth families. I
Mm,
know that that's supposed to happen in many cases. I know it's not always that easy, but I think sometimes adoptive parents still don't want to do that. I think it must be difficult for them because they think this is my child now. But I think it's really helpful to stay in, and especially siblings, if siblings have been separated, I hope that they can try and keep them in touch with each other and perhaps meet up with each other.
mm,
I think that would be really helpful. But also the way adopted parents speak about birth parents or biological family, I think
mm,
it's really important to not be derogatory or be negative about them, which would be easy to do because some of these people have done some terrible things, but it's still their family, isn't it?
mm,
And it's still where they've come from. Um, I know from my own experience a similar thing happened, in that I found out some information about my birth family, that my parents didn't know I'd out about. And um, my parents were quite derogatory about a certain group of people, which happened to be that my birth father was from. And it didn't make me feel very good about myself,
mhm.
you know.
So they were derogatory about his culture, or
About his role in the army and
yeah,
his
yeah,
job,
yeah.
and yeah,
Hmm.
and they
Yeah,
didn't even realize they were doing it actually. They didn't realize they were doing it
no,
too,
yeah.
but
So sort of in a way keeping a respectful view of birth parents who have had to give up children for adoption,
yeah,
because that is the only way to go with anybody, really. I think, you know,
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
that
absolutely,
you don't have to pay. I think it's a mistake to paint a super idealized picture. I think that, but to have a respectful, mindful
yeah,
picture to help children, because what that does is help children hold in their minds, oh, there's this tolerable person who had their own story.
yes,
And children can, on the whole, maybe some children need a little bit more help than others, but they need to be able to hold in their mind in a tolerable way the story of their birth parents. And so we need to be careful how they are painted.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, so you're thinking that and I think it's certainly something that gets looked at a lot, that how do we keep family connections going? Because the thing is this, that they're going to happen in the end.
yeah,
You,
they are,
yeah, you
yeah,
can't actually stop that incredible power of
um,
biological connection from happening. And as you and I well know, I mean, your birth mother, found you quite easily, when she
yeah,
went to the right people. But even in the last 5 years, it's become much easier to find people, that you can trace people through.
yes, and that
Yeah,
was without even knowing my name.
she didn't know your
No,
name. and she didn't.
So
Yeah.
nowadays you'd just look on social media, wouldn't you?
You'd look on social media, or you'd go onto an ancestry or
Mm,
one of those websites and DNA websites, and there you are. It's happening
mm,
all the time. You can't really hide in this day
no,
and age. So that connection is going to happen in the end. And I'm always mindful in the European Charter for Human Rights for Children, it actually states really clearly that children have a right to know their family of origin. And and that's not, and I'm sure that you and I will absolutely state very clearly, it's not disrespectful of amazing adoptive parents who are doing a great job.
yeah, no,
It,
absolutely.
yeah, it's just that, and I think that adoptive mums and dads need a lot of help with holding their child in mind with that view. That's what we have to help them to
Yes,
do. And
yeah,
I don't know, Nikki, but I think if that had been held in mind a lot more for you, it might have been a bit of a more comfortable
yeah.
ride.
I
Yeah,
think so. I think
yeah,
so.
yeah.
I don't. It wasn't done on purpose. It was just, yeah. They didn't.
Mm,
They didn't know that I'd found out some information. Um, I also think it would be useful for children. It's going to sound funny coming from me as a teacher, but if we educate educators,
mm,
about trauma,
mm,
lots of teachers don't understand trauma. Lots of
mhm,
teachers don't understand attachment theory, and just a little bit of education um, would go a long way
mm, mm.
towards to making life, and also about the difficulties of doing things like family trees. And
Yeah.
I was a little bit shocked to come back to my classroom. I'm going to say this really carefully now. Come back to my classroom recently with a group of children to find that the other group of children were working on family trees with another
Mm,
teacher. And I was like, well, nobody told me this was going to happen. I would have
mm,
quite liked to have been part of the planning of this so that we could have handled it. And I'm sure she did handle it really well, because this particular person is a practitioner and she's lovely, and I'm sure it was done. But I suppose I was shocked by it.
mm.
Nobody thinks about that for adopted children. But I think
No.
even non-adopted children have complicated families these days. You know?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I see it so much. We get so many different shapes to families, don't we? We have gay couples,
Yeah,
children, and we have single parents, and we have transgender parents, and we have
yes,
so many different types. And we have grandparents that raise children, we have special guardianships, we have all sorts. And we also have adoptive parents, we have foster parents that children have. And it's so easy to unwittingly make a child feel left out when you get to, oh, tell us about your family. We really just need to adjust our wording on that,
yeah. And I'm
because,
sure this particular person did actually.
yeah.
I was just surprised.
Yeah, sure. I
Mm.
mean, I'm always surprised when I hear and I have adopted kids say to me, "Oh, we didn't know what to do and we didn't know what to say," and I think, "Oh, what a shame. Your story would is amazing. We needed to share that, because it's that basic sense of belonging, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
that one, that we're all part of this. It doesn't matter what shape your family comes in. And you and I have talked in an adopted adults group, and I know that one of the key themes would be that sense of belonging. And sometimes adopted people just don't feel they can't quite find their place in all of
yeah,
this.
yeah, absolutely. I think that's just a sense of feeling different.
Yeah. I really want to, encourage adopted people to own their unique life and get into it and come in and say, yeah, that's me. I'm adopted. I'm different, but I still belong here,
Yeah,
and I show up. I still show up. And I know that you and I know an adopted adult, and one of the things that she said that was so special to us both was she said, I really like being me. And do you remember that
yeah,
particular
I do.
adopted
Yeah,
adult? And
yeah.
and that's just like, yeah, that's what I want. I want adopted people to show up and say, I'm adopted and I love being me. It's that's where we want to. That's a thriving adoptee. But I think it would be really nice to just wind up a bit, because I know that there was that such a sad story of not ever connecting with your birth mom by minutes virtually. But since you have found family, are you able to tell us a little bit without naming your family? Are you able to
Yeah, sure.
tell us
Yeah. So my mother didn't have any more children after me, which actually I find incredibly sad. She wanted to and never managed to. But she had a sister who had her own children. Her sister has also died, but my cousins, they live not very far away from me, a couple of hours drive, in a place that we often visit. Um, we had been visiting before I knew that they lived there. Um, and so now I visit them as often as I can. Takes a bit of a quite a complicated journey with a ferry involved. But yes, I see them as much as I can, and they've been to visit me. I've also had a piece of DNA research done, so that I could find out exactly where my father was. My father, unfortunately, had also um, very recently died, but I did discover I've got a half sister and two half brothers.
Is
So,
that through your father, your birth
from
father?
my birth
Yeah,
father.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so I'm in touch with my half sister,
Mm.
and we message regularly, and we are hoping to meet up. She weirdly lives or comes from, my father came from the town I went to university in the north of England, which is very bizarre because I had no connection to that city at all.
Oh, oh,
I, I can't even figure out why I chose that city, but I went there and lived there, and that's where part of me was from. So that was
yeah.
a coincidence, really. So I'm hoping to meet my sister and some of her family.
Yeah. Is it coincidence or is it that genetic
I don't know.
glue that just comes out,
I
you know?
know.
Because I do hear it a lot that people say, "Oh, I was in the town and that was where they were," you know, which is just
Yeah, but it was nowhere near where I ever lived,
no,
quite a
strange.
long distance away. So it was just, yeah,
So do you think that you would say to adopted people that are doing traces that even though they might have one really disappointing story, that maybe don't give up? Do you think or do you think there's a case for stopping and close? I suppose it depends.
I think it depends on
Yeah.
how. I think some people are just shut down by some relatives and um, not welcomed into the family, no, back into the family.
Mm.
Um, I think that's very difficult. It's another rejection, isn't it? Um, but I do think it's useful to know just a little bit about your family, even if it doesn't go well. I think,
Yes. Yes, I think that's a really important thing that we ought to say because I think when we're dealing with the mind and therefore, in my view, we're dealing with realities because reality impacts on us right now, doesn't it? And I think there is a reality that we can have very hopeful ideals about meeting our birth family, and then sometimes we can meet them and it gets very complicated. We might not get on, we might see them as extremely different. And I know that's very, very turbulent story for people.
it's
And I
really hard,
it's
actually.
very hard. Yeah. And I think we just ought to put a shout out there and say, I think that that can happen. It's true. And that you must be able to take care of yourself in any process like that and be able to step back if it's not right for you and not blame yourself if that does not go well. Yeah, I think it's so vital to
Yeah,
know that you
definitely.
will have seen that, and I certainly have, where I have to say to people, you tried, you wanted to connect, you got so far, and that's not going any further, and that's your closure. But I think it's quite good to end on that word is that people are looking for some kind of completion and closure to their story.
Yeah,
I mean, I know with your mum, it was very sad, but we weren't at closure. We didn't get to closure.
no.
We were only halfway there. You had a way to go, and people in this is adopted or otherwise, we need a sense of closure and completion to that particular cycle.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Also, I think when you're working with relatives, meeting relatives and trying to get to know them, they are going to be different to you. And I think you've got to be a little bit open-minded with that, you know,
Yes,
give
yes,
them a bit of room too, because it's probably really shocking for them, many of them.
yes.
So, but yeah, you're right about the closure.
Sometimes you may have to step back, and that might be closure. And I think
Yeah,
in closure to this amazing, thank you so much for your openness, Nickie, because I know that this conversation will help adopted people, and it will help non-adopted people to understand, maybe to be more open to their adoptive friends, and to, not to make assumptions as we do about this particular group of people who have had this experience. In a way, you'll forgive the word, but it's the only word I can think of. It's kind of like a minority group, isn't it, with a sort of
yeah, I
unique
think so.
identity.
I really think so, actually. It's
Yeah,
kind of like
yeah.
a group that's not treated quite as well as they should be.
No, not really as thoughtfully or as knowledgeably.
Not by everybody, but I mean like
Yeah,
by the government and by social services sometimes, and by the people who have the records, and
yeah. The system
yeah.
hasn't been generous, has it? No, the system
Uh,
has not been generous. Nickie, thank you so much. Always.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Check out the next episode on our platform. Don't forget, I'm a doctor of psychotherapy, not medicine or clinical psychology. My expertise lies in the field of applied psychology through psychotherapeutic models of practice. This podcast is not intended for diagnosis or treatment of any kind. If you are concerned about your mental health, do consult your doctor, who will guide you. If you are ever in a mental health crisis within the UK, dial 999. In all other parts of the world, check your mental health facilities or turn to someone who will support you.